Imagine spending 30 years of your life mastering a completely unwritten language.
Just immersing yourself entirely.
Right. You sit with the native speakers in these sub-zero winds. You're compiling a massive 32,000-word dictionary that maps out, every single nuance of the ice, the wind, survival itself.
And it really is your life's work.
Exactly. Driven by what seems to be a genuine, deep love for these people. Only as you near the end of this manuscript, you look around and you realize that by living with them to write it all down, your very presence is killing them.
The European norms you brought with you?
Yeah. The clothing, the ships, it's exactly what's destroying them. Welcome to the deep dive.
It really is the ultimate devastating paradox of colonial contact. And I think it perfectly sets the tone for what we're examining today.
Which is an incredibly heavy topic.
Very heavy. This dossier covers what is essentially a historical and moral abyss. We're looking at the extreme southern tip of the Americas, Patagonia, and Tierra del Fuego.
Right down at the end of the world.
Exactly. And we're looking at this brutal collision between European missionaries, corporate sheep ranchers, and the native Fuegian peoples. Specifically, the Yámana, who are also known as the Yaghan, and the Selknam.
So let's unpack this for you listening right now, because what we are looking at today, it really challenges those neat, sanitized versions of history we are so often taught in school.
The ones that gloss over the reality.
Right. We have this stack of primary sources, historical mission records, colonial documents, and crucially, contemporary indigenous testimonies.
Those testimonies are vital here.
They really are. Our mission today is to trace this deeply somber narrative. We're going to examine the stark reality of corporate genocide and the terrible ambiguity of these religious missions.
Missions that operated with good intentions but caused real harm.
Yeah. And ultimately, we're looking at a modern story of survival against a textbook narrative that just labeled these people as extinct.
Which they absolutely refuse to accept.
Yeah.
To truly grasp the gravity of this collision, though, we first need to establish the physical reality of Tierra del Fuego.
Right. The geography itself is a character in this story.
It is. This is an archipelago at the absolute edge. It is a place of these massive katabatic winds that just howl down from the glaciers.
Frigid, storm-battered waters.
Yeah, and impenetrable kelp forests. For European explorers in the mid-19th century, it was an alien, completely hostile environment.
But not for the Yámana.
No, not at all. For the Yámana, it was a home they had mastered over millennia. They had this highly specialized, accumulated knowledge of how to survive there.
Which makes the initial European attempts to make contact there almost darkly comedic. I mean, if the results weren't so completely fatal.
Tragic, really.
We have to start with the early Anglicans, specifically a man named Allen Gardiner. This is in 1851.
Right.
Gardiner is this retired British naval captain, and he turns into a deeply zealous missionary. He basically decides he is going to plant European religion at the tip of the continent.
And Gardiner's expedition in 1851 is just, it's a masterclass in Victorian hubris.
Hubris is the perfect word for it.
He was driven by this theological zeal that was just completely divorced from the ecological reality of the place he was sailing into. He honestly believed that his faith and his European ingenuity would be sufficient.
And his version of ingenuity was bringing iron boats down to the Beagle Channel. I mean, from a practical standpoint, why iron boats?
Well, it was a cutting edge of industrial European technology at the time.
Right, the newest thing.
Yeah. Gardiner assumed that what worked on the Thames back in London or in standard naval operations would just naturally be superior to the bark canoes of the indigenous people.
Because it's European, so it must be better.
Exactly. But iron boats are heavy, and they are completely impossible to repair without a specialized forge. Plus, they are freezing cold to the touch in sub-zero weather.
I can't even imagine sitting in an iron boat in freezing water.
And they're incredibly difficult to maneuver through those dense kelp beds of the Fuegian coast that we mentioned.
It's like trying to explore a really dense jungle in a sports car just because the car was expensive.
That's a great analogy.
So Gardiner arrives with these totally inappropriate vessels. He has zero grasp of the local climate and absolutely no understanding of how to forage or hunt for local food sources.
Not at all.
But the most baffling part of the record, for me anyway, is his psychological disconnect. He goes there entirely to, quote-unquote, save the Yámana people. Yet the moment he actually encounters them, he is terrified.
Yeah, the primary sources reveal a really profound prejudice. Gardiner and his 6 companions couldn't communicate with the Yámana, obviously. And they viewed them through this lens of absolute colonial superiority mixed with, like you said, deep fear.
Right.
So instead of relying on the very people who knew how to survive this environment, people who could have easily shown them how to fish or hunt seals or just stay warm, Gardiner's crew retreated.
They actively hid from the people they came to convert.
They isolated themselves. They eventually barricaded themselves in a cove, basically just waiting for a British supply ship.
A ship that had been delayed by weather and logistical failures back home. And the mechanism of their demise is just brutal. They slowly starve to death, all 7 of them, sitting in a cave. And they are literally surrounded by a marine ecosystem that the Yámana had been successfully harvesting for thousands of years.
That's a stark image.
It really highlights how ideological blindness literally overrides the basic human survival instinct to just ask for help.
It does. They died of scurvy and starvation because they simply could not bridge the gap between their preconceived notions of savagery and the reality of the highly capable human being standing right in front of them.
So, reading this, you would assume the South American Missionary Society, or SAMS, which is the Anglican organization backing all this, you'd think they would look at Gardiner's diary, look at the frozen bodies, and completely rethink their approach.
You would hope for a moment of deep institutional humility.
Right, humility. But historically, institutional humility is pretty rare.
Very rare. SAMS did not scale back. They actually expanded, but they changed their logistics.
Okay, how so?
Instead of trying to live on the Yámana's turf immediately, they established a base in the Falkland Islands, which, is hundreds of miles away in the South Atlantic.
Right, far removed from the actual harshness of Tierra del Fuego.
Exactly. Their new strategy became extraction. They decided to coax, or in many documented cases, simply take Yámana families from Tierra del Fuego and transport them across the ocean to the Falklands.
The rationale being, well, we failed in your homeland because it's too harsh for us, so we are going to remove you to our controlled environment to civilize you.
Precisely. The goal was to create this sanitized, heavily controlled environment. There, the Yámana could be taught English, agriculture, and Christianity, entirely isolated from their traditional cultural influences.
And then what? Send them back?
Yes. The plan was to then send these converted individuals back to Tierra del Fuego to evangelize their own people.
That sets the stage for a massive escalation, because by 1859, SAMS decides it's time to try planting a permanent station again, this time at a place called Wulaia Bay. They send a schooner, they bring some of the Yámana who had been taken to the Falklands, and they attempt to establish a beachhead.
Which brings us to the Wulaia Bay massacre. The records from 1859 show that the missionaries attempted to hold a Sunday religious service on the beach.
A public service.
Yes. But during that service, the Yámana rose up, attacked the missionaries, and killed the entire crew. They spared only the ship's cook.
So let's dig into the why here. Because in a lot of older textbooks, an event like this is just glossed over as unprovoked, random savagery.
Just senseless violence.
Right. But the sources in our dossier paint a completely different picture of the months leading up to that Sunday on the beach.
The context is absolutely crucial here. The violence at Wulaia Bay was the culmination of months of intense systemic friction. The missionaries were operating with the exact same assumption of European superiority as Gardiner had.
They hadn't learned that lesson.
Not at all. They showed zero respect for Yámana social structures, their leadership, or their property rights. Crucially, there are explicit records indicating that the missionaries had been habitually stealing from the Yámana.
Wait, they were actually taking their belongings?
Yes, they were confiscating items they deemed inappropriate or simply taking what they wanted. This fundamentally violated the complex reciprocal trade and property systems of the indigenous community.
So they weren't just culturally insensitive, they were actively taking things.
They treated the Yámana as subjects to be managed, not as autonomous neighbors with rights.
Which completely reframes the narrative of the massacre. I mean, if an armed foreign group arrives on your shore, attempts to dictate your behavior, disrespects your leaders, and repeatedly steals your possessions, a violent mutiny isn't savagery.
No, it's defense.
It is a defensive, entirely inevitable human response to systemic mistreatment.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Wulaia massacre is a rare, heavily documented instance of immediate indigenous pushback against a mission's early abuses. The missionaries were essentially acting as an occupying force, but without the actual military strength to back it up. They were relying entirely on the assumption that their perceived moral authority would somehow protect them.
And that assumption cost them their lives. But this bloody failure at Wulaia is the catalyst for the single biggest shift in Anglican strategy, isn't it?
It is.
Because they realize they cannot force their way in, and they certainly cannot remain ignorant of the people they are dealing with.
The shock of Wulaia Bay forced Sams to understand that brute force, extraction, and ignorance were terminal strategies. They just wouldn't work.
Right.
If they were going to survive, let alone fulfill their religious mandate, they needed deep, sustained cultural immersion.
Which brings us to a figure who operates as the exact inverse of Allen Gardiner. Yet his story is arguably even more heartbreaking because of his intentions. We need to look at Thomas Bridges.
Thomas Bridges is undoubtedly one of the most complex, paradoxical figures in colonial history. He wasn't a retired naval captain like Gardiner. He was an orphan.
Raised by the society itself.
Yes, raised from childhood by the Sam's missionaries.
Yeah.
He actually grew up on the Falkland Islands base, interacting directly with the Yámana families who had been brought there.
So from a very young age, he is actually hearing the language. He isn't arriving as a fearful adult who has never seen these people.
Exactly. It completely changes his baseline. And in 1869, he takes the monumental step of founding a peaceful mission at Ushuaia.
He becomes the first permanent white settler in Tierra del Fuego.
He does. But what truly sets Bridges apart from every European who came before him is that he took the indigenous mind seriously, on its own terms.
And we really have to talk about what that mind had achieved, because the Yámana were canoe-faring people. To survive in sub-zero, storm-tossed waters in an open-bark canoe, it requires a level of precision that is honestly hard for us to fathom today.
The mechanics of their daily survival were just astonishing. They built these canoes out of beech bark, and they maintained a constant fire on a bed of clay and earth right in the center of the boat.
Fire inside a bark canoe on the ocean.
Yes. They lived, traveled, and hunted in these vessels, and the stakes were absolute. If your fire goes out, or if your bark canoe breaches in the 30-degree water, you die. It's that simple.
You cannot just be lucky for 1,000 years.
No, you can't.
That kind of survival requires an exact, specialized knowledge of the environment, the weather patterns, the materials, everything. And Bridges realizes that this immense precision has to be reflected in how they communicate.
Language is the ultimate map of how a culture navigates its reality. But the Yámana language had been entirely dismissed by the scientific community of the time. We really have to look at Charles Darwin's assessment here.
Right, Darwin. He traveled through the Beagle Channel in the 1830s.
And Darwin, who is celebrated as one of the greatest observational scientists in human history, just writes off the Yámana completely.
How so? What did he say?
He notoriously documented their language as scarcely articulate. He actually compared it to the clucking of animals.
Which is just staggering arrogance.
It was. Darwin was viewing them through this incredibly rigid lens of Victorian anthropology. That lens equated civilization with very specific things: agriculture, permanent buildings, and tailored clothing.
Right, the markers of Europe.
Exactly. Because the Yámana lacked those specific markers, Darwin concluded they were at the absolute bottom of the human evolutionary ladder. And therefore, he assumed their language must be primitive.
But Bridges proves the greatest scientist of his era completely wrong.
He does.
Bridges spends 3 decades living at Ushuaia. He immerses himself entirely in the daily rhythms of the Yámana, and he compiles a Yámana English dictionary.
And this was not a simple phrasebook for trading, just words for a fish or boat. Bridges painstakingly documented over 32,000 words.
Let that number sink in for a second. 32,000 words. I mean, most of us don't use a fraction of that in our daily lives.
The linguistic depth is staggering. Bridges discovered that the language was, in many ways, structurally richer and more nuanced than literary English.
Because their survival depended on the environment, the language evolved to describe it with microscopic precision.
Exactly. The sources list some of these examples, and they are beautiful. They had dozens of highly specific verbs just to describe the nuances of wind.
Like what kind of nuances?
Well, whether it was wind dropping snow or wind blowing off the water, or the wind shifting directions. They had incredibly complex vocabulary for social relations, for different kinds of looking, for the specific ways ice forms on kelp.
It's so specific.
Bridges' dictionary mapped an intricate, highly sophisticated cognitive universe. It proved undeniably that the Yámana were not primitive survivors barely scraping by, but absolute masters of their domain.
Here's where it gets really interesting and deeply heartbreaking. Think about the level of intimacy required to compile a 32,000-word dictionary of a completely foreign, unwritten language.
You can't do that from a desk.
No, you have to sit with people for years. You have to ask questions, share meals, weather storms with them, and listen intently to the elders. It's clear that Bridges genuinely loved the Yámana.
His dedication to their language is undeniable proof of his deep respect for their cognitive and cultural complexity. He saw them as fully realized human beings, which was rare.
But this brings us to the tragic paradox at the center of Bridges' life. Despite his love and despite this incredible act of cultural preservation, his mission at Ushuaia becomes the primary vector for their absolute destruction.
It does. And it happens through the most seemingly benign mechanisms of good intentions.
Let's walk through that.
Well, the missionaries, while respecting the language, still felt a moral imperative to enforce Victorian standards of civilization. And one of the primary pillars of that was modesty.
Meaning they wanted the Yámana to cover up their bodies.
Yes, the mission began heavily distributing European clothing to the Yámana. We're talking wool sweaters, cotton trousers, heavy woven coats.
So let's break down the mechanics of why this was so lethal. Because on paper, giving warm clothes to people in a freezing climate sounds like a humanitarian act. But what were the Yámana traditionally wearing before this?
Traditionally, they wore very little in terms of fitted clothing. They utilized animal skins, particularly guanaco hides and seal skins, which they just wore loosely over their shoulders.
Right.
But more importantly, they constantly coated their bodies in animal fat, particularly seal blubber.
Which acts as a waterproofing agent.
Exactly. The fat repelled the freezing seawater and the rain. The loose hides allowed air to circulate, meaning if they did get wet, they dried very quickly by the fire.
It's an active system.
Their traditional method was a highly evolved dynamic system for shedding constant freeze and moisture.
And what happens when you introduce tightly woven European wool and cotton into that specific wet environment?
It acts as a sponge. The European clothing absorbed the sea spray, the rain, and the snow. Because it was fitted, it trapped that freezing dampness directly against their skin.
It just holds the cold water against them.
It never truly dried out in that climate.
So you have an entire population suddenly walking around in freezing, wet clothes all day and all night. The biological result is immediate. It breeds respiratory disease.
It triggered rampant, lethal waves of pneumonia. The very garments meant to civilize and protect their modesty fundamentally compromised their physical ability to survive the climate they had mastered for millennia.
It is a devastating mechanism of unintended harm. You bring them clothes to save them, and the clothes kill them, but the clothing was only the first wave, wasn't it? The second wave comes from the infrastructure of the mission itself.
Right. By establishing a permanent mission, Bridges inadvertently created a centralized hub. Ushuaia became a fixed point on the map.
Which changes the flow of traffic in the region.
Exactly. Soon, Argentine and Chilean naval and merchant ships began to use his settlement as a safe port to resupply.
And a port is a doorway.
It's a doorway for pathogens. With those ships came European diseases that the Yámana, having lived in relative geographic isolation, had absolutely no immunological defense against.
The records specify measles and smallpox, right?
Yes. So you have a population that is already physically weakened by constant pneumonia from the wet European clothing, and they are suddenly exposed to highly contagious lethal viruses brought in by passing sailors.
The epidemiological collapse is horrifying in its speed and scale.
It was devastating. Disease swept through the camps around the mission. Bridges and the missionaries found themselves turning from linguists and preachers into, essentially, overwhelmed hospice workers.
Burying the very people they had come to live alongside.
Yeah.
The demographic numbers in the dossier are just staggering. Within roughly 20 years of the mission's establishment, the Yámana population plummeted from an estimated 3,000 people to fewer than 300.
That is the eradication of roughly 90% of an entire civilization in a single generation.
It's hard to even process that scale of loss.
And it forces us to confront a very uncomfortable historical reality. Good intentions, when coupled with an absolute ignorance of local ecology and biology, are simply not enough to halt systemic destruction.
In this case, the mission's good intentions were the very mechanism of that destruction. It makes me think about that 32,000-word dictionary.
How so?
The analogy that comes to mind is the black box of a crashed airplane.
Oh, wow.
The dictionary is this meticulously detailed, incredibly complex record of a magnificent vessel. It records every system, every movement, every nuance of their world. But the only reason you are retrieving it, the only reason it exists in this form is because a catastrophic, entirely preventable destruction has occurred.
That is a very apt framing. Bridges' dictionary shifted its fundamental nature in real time. It began as an active tool for communication, a living bridge between two peoples.
Right, a way to talk to each other.
But as he was writing it, defining the words for wind and ice, the voices speaking those words were coughing and dying in the tents outside his window.
So by the time the dictionary was finished, it was no longer a tool for dialogue.
No. It was an archive, a tombstone of a dying civilization, recorded by the man whose settlement helped cause their end. It is a level of historical tragedy that is just incredibly difficult to fully process.
It really is. And yet, while the coastal Yámana in the south fell to this largely unintentional, disease-driven erasure, a much more deliberate, industrialized, and violent tragedy was actively being engineered just to the north.
Right. To understand this next chapter, we really have to shift our focus geographically and economically.
So we're moving away from the channels.
Yes. While Bridges was compiling his dictionary in the southern channels, the Industrial Revolution up in Europe was creating massive new global demands, specifically a booming demand for wool to feed the textile mills of Britain and Europe.
And that economic demand completely changes how the modern states view the northern plains of Tierra del Fuego.
Exactly. The northern part of the main island is very different from the southern channels. It consists of these vast, sweeping plains. And this was the traditional territory of the Selknam people,
Who are also known as the Ona. And the Selknam were entirely different from the canoe-faring Yámana. They were tall, nomadic hunters. Their entire culture and survival revolved around the guanaco.
which is a wild, roaming relative of the llama.
Right. So the Selknam followed the migration patterns of the guanaco across these massive, open plains. But in the 1880s, the governments of Argentina and Chile looked at those same plains and realized they were perfectly suited for grazing sheep.
The climate was ideal for it.
So the states began carving up the map.
They handed out massive tracts of Selknam territory as land concessions. These went to European corporate magnates men, like Julius Popper, Mauricio Braun, and Jose Menendez.
These men established massive sheep farming corporations.
And the very first thing a sheep corporation does when it acquires land is assert control over it. They build fences.
And we really need to look at the mechanism of that disruption, because a fence doesn't just mark property, it physically alters the ecosystem.
It does. The introduction of barbed wire to Tierra del Fuego was essentially a weapon of mass disruption. The corporations took an open, nomadic hunting ground and carved it into strict geometric grids.
It cuts off the Selknam from their traditional centuries-old migration routes, and more importantly, it blocks the movement of the guanaco.
The guanaco were either driven off the fence land or they were actively slaughtered to make room for the sheep.
Right, they're a competition for the grass.
Exactly. So, almost overnight, the primary food source for the Selknam vanished. They found themselves suddenly starving on the very land they had inhabited for generations.
So the Selknam did what any starving people with a deep hunting tradition would do. They adapted to the new reality. They saw these new, slow-moving animals grazing on their land, and they hunted them.
They referred to the sheep as white guanacos.
Which makes total sense from their perspective.
Absolutely. From the Selknam perspective, they were simply hunting the available fauna on their own territory to survive. But from the perspective of the corporate ranchers, the Selknam were stealing private property.
Wait, I need to stop you there.
Sure.
Because when we look at most colonial history, the pattern is usually exploitation. The colonizers arrive, they take the land, and then they try to enslave or subjugate the indigenous population to use them as a cheap labor force.
That is the standard model, yes.
So why did these corporations default straight to extermination instead of trying to force the Selknam to shear the sheep or work the farms?
That is a crucial distinction to make. The answer lies in the specific economics of sheep farming and the sociology of nomadic hunters.
Okay, unpack that.
Sheep farming is highly land-intensive, but it requires very little labor. You need vast amounts of acreage to feed the flocks, but only a handful of men on horseback to manage thousands of sheep.
So they didn't actually need a massive labor force.
Exactly. They had no economic use for the people already living there. Furthermore, a deeply entrenched nomadic hunting culture does not easily transition to the stationary, monotonous, subservient labor required by a European farm.
It's a completely different way of life.
It is. The corporations didn't see a potential labor pool. They saw humans who were entirely incompatible with their business model. Because the land had been entirely commodified for the global market, the indigenous inhabitants were reclassified.
Reclassified how?
They were no longer viewed as humans, they were viewed as an agricultural pest.
An interference with capital.
Exactly. And the corporate response to an agricultural pest is extermination.
This is where the dossier becomes truly harrowing, because this wasn't just casual frontier violence or, isolated skirmishes over property. It was systematized, industrialized murder. The corporations hired heavily armed mercenaries.
They brought in professionals, often veterans of European wars or hardened frontiersmen, and they instituted a formal bounty system.
We have to explain the mechanics of this bounty system, as grim as it is, because it shows the absolute commodification of human life. How were these mercenaries paid?
The corporations paid a fixed rate in pounds sterling. But to collect the payment, the mercenary had to provide physical proof of the kill. Initially, the bounties were paid per pair of severed ears.
Just paying for ears.
Yes.
But the sources note that the mercenaries started cheating the system, right?
They did. The mercenaries realized they could cut the ears off living Selknam and let them go, artificially inflating their bounties without actually reducing the population as the ranchers wanted.
That is just deeply unsettling. So
Right.
what did the corporations do?
When the corporations discovered this, they changed the requirements. The bounties were escalated to require severed breasts or entire human heads.
Just sit with the reality of that for a moment. You have a modern corporation tied directly to the global textile market, keeping ledgers and paying out British pounds sterling for severed human heads.
It is the absolute industrialization of genocide.
And it raises an unavoidable question about the complicity of the modern states here. This wasn't happening in a vacuum or some lawless void. The governments of Argentina and Chile had granted these concessions, knowing full well the Selknam lived there.
They did. And by failing to intervene, and in some cases even providing military support to the ranchers, the states effectively licensed the erasure of a people in the name of economic development.
I have to press you on the international context, though. We're talking about the late 19th and early 20th century. Telegraphs exist. Global newspapers exist. Paying bounties for human heads. Surely word of this leaked out.
It absolutely did.
How did these governments handle the optics of open slaughter while trying to present themselves as civilized nations to European investors?
You are exactly right to ask that. It became a massive international scandal. Missionaries, travelers, and even some dissenting local officials began writing reports.
The word got out.
Accounts of the human hunts reached Buenos Aires, Santiago, and eventually Europe. It became an absolute optical nightmare for Argentina and Chile.
Because foreign investors get skittish when the land they are investing in is the site of a highly publicized bloodbath.
Precisely. The states needed a solution. They needed a way to make the killing stop, or at the very least make it look like it had stopped, without angering the powerful sheep corporations and without giving the land back to the Selknam.
They needed to sanitize the removal.
And to achieve this sanitization, the states turned to the church. This brings us to what is arguably the darkest compromise in the entire historical record we have.
We need to introduce the Salesians of Don Bosco here. This was an Italian Catholic order, and down in Patagonia, they were led by a man named Bishop Jose Fagnano.
Right. The states forged a formal partnership with Bishop Fuegian and the Salesians. The arrangement was essentially a logistical handoff.
How did it work?
The military and the police would sweep the plains, round up the surviving Selknam who hadn't been killed by the bounty hunters, and ship them off to isolated mission hostels run by the church.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. The most infamous of these missions was called St. Joseph, located on Dawson Island, which is a remote, freezing island in the Strait of Magellan.
Now, on paper, the stated aim of the church and the narrative they provided to the press was that they were stepping in to save the Selknam. They were rescuing them from the mercenaries' rifles.
And technically, in a very narrow, literal sense, they did achieve that specific goal. Transporting them to Dawson Island did remove them from the crosshairs of the bounty hunters.
But we have to look closely at the terrible ambiguity of this arrangement, because the result of this rescue was devastating.
It was.
The analogy that fits here, I think, is building an ecological terrarium. Imagine someone trying to save a species of animal from poachers, so they build a massive glass box to keep them safe.
Right.
But the person building the box doesn't actually understand the ecosystem. They put the animals inside, lock the door, but they forget to add ventilation, and they put in the wrong food. The intent is documented as sanctuary, but the mechanism turns it into an incubator for death.
That is a chillingly accurate description of the mechanics of Dawson Island. When the Selknam arrived at the St. Joseph mission, They were subjected to immediate, profound cultural and physical trauma.
Because the missionaries wanted to change them.
The missionaries believed that to save their souls, they had to break their previous way of life.
And that starts with the physical body, right?
Yes. The very first thing they did was strip the Selknam of their warm guanaco robes, and their hair, which offered significant protection against the cold, was shorn off.
Once again, we see the tragic imposition of European standards. Just like with the Yámana, they took away the very clothing technology that allowed them to survive the sub-zero climate.
It's the exact same mistake. These nomadic hunters were then locked into crowded, damp, poorly ventilated wooden barracks. To instill a Protestant work ethic, they were forced into sedentary, European-style labor.
What kind of labor?
Primarily weaving and rudimentary agriculture, which completely disrupted their physical routines and their relationship with the land.
And what were they eating during all this?
This was the final blow, really. They were cut off from their traditional, highly nutritious, high-protein diet of guanaco meat. Instead, they were fed a European diet of starches and whatever meager crops could be grown on a freezing island.
So let's look at the biological reality of that situation. You have a population suffering from extreme psychological trauma and displacement. They are stripped of their protective clothing. They are crammed tightly together in damp, cold buildings with zero airflow.
Right.
And their immune systems are plummeting due to malnutrition from the starchy diet.
It is a textbook recipe for an epidemiological catastrophe. Within the confined spaces of those barracks, diseases like tuberculosis, influenza, and measles ran rampant.
And they had no immunity.
The Selknam had no immunity and no physical reserves left to fight off the infections. They died in droves.
So Dawson Island, which was billed to the world as a sanctuary, just became a massive cemetery.
The numbers confirm the scale of the failure. The sources note that the Selknam population, which stood at roughly 4,000 in the 1880s before the fences went up, fell to fewer than 100 individuals by 1930.
From 4,000 to less than 100 in 50 years.
Yes.
Which forces us to carefully and impartially confront a massive historical debate that is present in the scholarship. How do we actually classify Dawson Island?
It's a very difficult question.
Was it a genuine, well-intentioned refuge that spectacularly failed due to medical ignorance? Or was it an accomplice to genocide, what some historians and descendants bluntly call a sanitary death camp?
We must adhere strictly to the facts of the outcome here. The internal intent of the Salesian priests may have been to save souls and bodies. They did write letters expressing real sorrow at the deaths.
They weren't cheering it on.
No. But functionally, the confinement and the disease accomplished exactly what the sheep corporations and the state wanted all along. The land was cleared of its original inhabitants.
It just happened quietly.
Yes. Away from the international press, under the banner of humanitarian aid.
The outcome is identical to the bounty hunters' bullets. The people are removed. And we really must emphasize how the descendants of the Selknam read this history today.
Absolutely.
They do not view the missions as saviors. They view them as an instrument of genocide that simply wore different robes.
And for nearly an entire century, that is exactly where the textbooks, the anthropologists, and the governments closed the book. They looked at the massive drop in population, the loss of the language, the absolute displacement, and they applied a very convenient final label to both the Yámana and the Selknam.
And that label was extinct.
Extinct.
Let's examine the mechanics of that word for a second, because extinct isn't just a biological term here. In this context, it is a highly weaponized political tool.
It is incredibly dangerous. When a modern state officially declares an indigenous population extinct, it creates a legal void. It legally absolves that state of any ongoing duty.
Right. You do not have to return stolen land to an extinct people.
You do not have to honor treaties, you don't have to allocate resources, or even offer a formal apology.
It consigns an entire civilization to the museum display case. It basically says, the story is over, the books are balanced, move on.
Exactly. It's a way of washing their hands of the whole thing. But the profound turn in our dossier today is that the people themselves have a completely different ending in mind.
The narrative shifts here, and it shifts hard. From a chronicle of horrific tragedy to a profound story of resilience and survival against all odds.
Because survival sometimes requires hiding.
Yes. We have to introduce the modern figures who absolutely refuse to accept the state's narrative of erasure. Let's start with the Yámana in the south and a woman named Cristina Calderón.
Cristina Calderón was just an extraordinary figure. She was born in 1928, so this is decades after the demographic collapse caused by the Ushuaia mission. And she passed away quite recently, actually, in 2022.
Wow, just a few years ago.
Yeah. For years, she was recognized as the last full-blooded Yaghan, and crucially, the very last native speaker of her language.
The exact same language that Thomas Bridges spent 30 years recording in his 32,000-word dictionary.
The very same. And what is most illuminating about Calderón's life is her description of her own survival strategy and the strategy of the generations immediately preceding her.
It reveals the heavy psychological toll of the colonial aftermath, right?
It does. She gave testimonies describing how, as she was growing up, outsiders and settlers continuously mocked their tongue. The dominant Chilean culture treated the Yaghan with intense prejudice, often referring to them as animals.
Because of that intense systemic prejudice and the very real threat of social or physical punishment, the survivors made a deliberate, agonizing calculation.
They chose to hide their language.
They stopped speaking it in public spaces. They stopped teaching it openly to the next generation.
Right. Imagine the profound resilience required to do that, to intentionally bury your own identity, to silence the language of your ancestors, just to protect your children from the gaze and the violence of the dominant culture.
They essentially went underground.
They traded visibility for survival.
But Calderón did not let the culture die completely.
No, she didn't. She kept it alive quietly through traditional practices like making intricate reed baskets. And as she grew older, and the global cultural climate slowly began to shift toward recognizing indigenous rights, she stepped out of the shadows.
She became a vital link to the past.
She was eventually recognized formally. She was named a living human treasure by UNESCO and the Chilean government.
But the most incredible full-circle moment of her life involves the linguistic legacy left behind by the missions. In her later years, Calderón worked with linguists to create bilingual educational materials.
And to do that, they utilized the very dictionary that Thomas Bridges had compiled a century earlier.
It is an almost unbelievable twist of historical irony. Bridges' dictionary, which we described earlier as a tragic tombstone of a dying civilization, is picked back up a century later.
It ceases to be an archive.
Right. It becomes an active tool for cultural revitalization.
Calderón used her own native knowledge, cross-referenced with Bridges' extensive 32,000-word documentation, to ensure that the mechanics, the verbs for the wind and the ice, were accurately recorded and passed down to her descendants.
She secured the linguistic heritage before she died of COVID-19 complications in 2022.
It is a massive victory of memory over erasure.
It really is. But there is also a victory of legal recognition, and for that, we look back to the north, to the Selknam.
The Selknam faced a different kind of erasure. Because of the sheer violence of the bounties and the Dawson Island camps, the state had officially, legally declared them gone. They were literally written out of the census.
But a modern Selknam leader named Hema'ny Molina took up the fight to dismantle this myth of extinction.
Molina and her community organized. They pushed back against Chilean government. They essentially said, look at us. We are still here.
The bounties didn't get all of us, and the camps didn't get all of us. We survived.
They initiated a grueling, years-long legal and anthropological battle to prove their continuous existence. And they achieved something monumental.
On September 5th, 2023, the Congress of Chile officially overturned the extinction narrative. They passed a law legally recognizing the Selknam as a living, original people of the nation.
It was a formal, legal repudiation of a century of historical erasure. It forced the state to legally reintegrate the Selknam into the present day.
The way Molina frames this history in her testimonies is just incredibly powerful. She says, "We believe there was a genocide, but we were not extinguished. We are alive."
She speaks directly to the ambiguity of the Salesian missions we discussed too. She notes that while the guns hunted them on the plains, the missions killed them more quietly.
But her core message is really about the defiance of her ancestors. She emphasizes that their grandparents survived the horrors of Dawson Island. And just like the Yámana, they realized that visibility was a liability.
So they hid their heritage.
They assimilated into the rural working class, they kept their heads down, but they passed the knowledge of who they were on in secret around the kitchen table.
And her final point is a devastating rebuke to the anthropologists, the historians, and the states who closed the book on them for 100 years.
Yeah.
She says, we are not photographs in a museum.
We are not photographs in a museum. That brings us to the end of this incredibly heavy deep dive.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. We have traced an arc from Allen Gardiner starving in a cave due to his own hubris to the Wulaia massacre born of systemic theft. We explored the tragic paradox of Thomas Bridges, documenting a 32,000-word linguistic masterpiece, while his woolen sweaters and port towns spread the diseases that silenced those very words.
We examined the brutal mechanics of the global wool trade, how corporate ranchers reclassified nomadic hunters as pests, paying pounds sterling for severed heads. And we looked at the agonizing compromise of the Salesian missions, a supposed rescue that functioned, biologically, as a quiet doom.
But the dossier ends on a refusal to be erased. Cristina Calderón and Hema'ny Molina prove that survival sometimes means hiding in plain sight, waiting for the era when it is finally safe to speak your true name again.
It forces a complete recalculation of how we read colonial history.
Mm.
Extinct is often just a word written by the victor to avoid looking for the survivors.
And that leaves us with a final thought to mull over. We've seen how the label of extinct was weaponized to legally erase the surviving people in Tierra del Fuego. It makes you wonder, look around at the cultures, the languages, or the communities in our modern world that the dominant culture dismisses as fading, lost, or assimilated.
Are they actually disappearing?
Right, or have they simply learned to hide in plain sight to survive our gaze? Who else is out there right now waiting for the right moment to say, we are not photographs in a museum?